23 women went to sleep in a stone convent above a coal town in West Virginia. By morning, every single one of them was dead. There were no wounds, no blood, no illness in the days before, no sign of a struggle, and no sign that anything had ever come through those doors. The county coroner wrote a single line in his report and then left the profession within a year. The convent was sealed. The town emptied out inside a decade. However, the building is still standing up on that ridge. And once you understand what it was actually built for, the deaths stop being the strangest part of this story. The town was called Carrow's Bend, and if you look for it on a modern map, you will not find it. It was one of hundreds of coal settlements that appeared across the Appalachian corridor between 1880 and 1910, grew fast, printed its own currency as company scrip, and then vanished so completely that the state stopped listing it in the census. The official story is simple enough. The coal ran thin, the company pulled out, the people left. That story is told about 1,000 towns and nobody questions it, because it sounds like economics. And economics is the one explanation nobody bothers to check. But Carrow's Bend has a problem, and the problem is the buildings. A coal town of that era looked a certain way. Wood frame houses on stilts, a company store, a tipple, a rail spur, a church built by a travelling carpenter with a hammer and whatever pine was nearby. These places were built to be temporary, and they looked it. What sat above Carrow's Bend was not that. It was a 4-story structure of dressed stone with vaulted ceilings, a full basement level with drainage channels cut directly into bedrock, and a masonry facade that would have required trained European stonecutters and roughly 2 years of continuous labour to produce. The town had a recorded population of around 1,100 people. It had no rail connection capable of hauling that volume of stone. It had no local quarry. And the company that supposedly built it, Carrow Anthracite and Land, has a surviving expense ledger from 1919 that lists every purchase down to lamp oil and nails with no line item for construction of any kind. So who paid for the convent? This is the question that pulls a thread through half the mountain towns in that corridor. You have been trained to see a beautiful old building and assume that somebody rich and forgotten built it, because that is the easiest thought available. Try holding a different one for 15 minutes. Try assuming the buildings were already there. The order that occupied it called themselves the Sisters of the Perpetual Ledger, and I want you to sit with that name for a second, because it is not a normal name for a religious order. Orders are named for saints, for sorrows, for mysteries and mercies and hearts. This one was named for a book of accounts. They arrived in 1907 according to the diocese, though the diocese has no record of chartering them, approving them, or sending them. They simply appeared, took the building, and began doing the work that made them tolerated. They ran an orphanage. Between 1907 and 1923, at least 400 children passed through that convent. We know this not from the sisters, who kept their own records and shared none of them, but from receiving stations in Baltimore and Philadelphia, where children were loaded onto westbound trains and signed for at the other end. This was the orphan train era, and it is one of the strangest chapters in American history. Somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 children were moved across the country by rail in a 50-year period, moved from cities that supposedly had too many of them, into towns that supposedly needed hands. Here is what makes Carrow's Bend different. The trains did not stop there. There was no passenger platform. And yet children kept arriving in groups, always at night, always accompanied by men in plain clothes who did not stay. The town knew. A woman named Verna Doyle, who was 19 in 1923 and lived to be 94, gave an interview to a regional oral history project in 1988, in which she described watching lanterns move up the ridge road in the dark, and counting the small shapes walking between them. She said the sisters were kind to the children. She also said the children never came back down. Now none of that is proof of anything. It is a story an old woman told about a night 60 years earlier, and memory is a liar. Keep that in your pocket. We will need it later. On the night of March 14th, 1923, a storm sat over the ridge. Not an unusual storm. Spring rain, heavy, the kind that turns the hollows into channels and pushes mud down every slope in that county. It rained for 11 hours. At some point between midnight and 4 in the morning, every woman inside that convent died. The bodies were found by a delivery driver named Aldous Renfrew, who came up the ridge road at dawn with flour and salt pork, and found the front door standing open. The door was open, and the storm had been driving straight into it for hours, and the floor of the entry hall was covered in a layer of silt that had washed in from outside. He found them in their rooms, some in their beds, some sitting upright in chairs, one in the chapel kneeling with her hands still folded. Renfrew told the sheriff that the strangest thing was not the bodies. It was that nothing in the building had been disturbed. No overturned furniture, no dropped candles, no fire, no smoke, no smell of gas, no broken glass. 23 women in a stone building had died without knocking over a single chair, and not one of them had a mark on her. The coroner was a man named Elias Hobbs, and he did what a rural coroner in 1923 was equipped to do, which was to look at the bodies and write down what he saw. He found no wounds, no bruising, no swelling of the tongue or discoloration of the skin that would suggest poison or suffocation. No froth in the airways. He noted that all 23 bodies were, in his words, cold and composed. He listed the cause of death as undetermined for all 23, and then he added one sentence that has kept this case alive for a century. He wrote that the bodies were dry. The door had been open for hours. Rain had been driving in hard enough to leave silt across the entry hall. The woman in the chapel was kneeling directly beneath a window that had been left unlatched, and the floor beneath that window was soaked. But her habit, her hair, her hands were completely dry. Hobbs resigned in January of 1924 and moved to Ohio, where he sold insurance until he died. He never spoke about Carrow's Bend again. And this is where the story gets taken over by people who want it to mean something. So let us do the boring thing first and take the mundane explanations seriously, because if we cannot knock them down, we have nothing. Carbon monoxide is the obvious one. Coal towns were full of it. A blocked flue in a stone building with the windows sealed against a spring storm could absolutely kill everyone inside overnight. And it kills quietly. People die in their beds and in their chairs. That fits. Except carbon monoxide poisoning leaves a signature that even a rural coroner in 1923 would have recognized, and it is not subtle. The skin turns a distinctive cherry red. Hobbs, who had certified dozens of minor deaths and knew exactly what gas did to a body, recorded normal coloration. And the front door was standing wide open into a storm, which is the opposite of a sealed building. Influenza is the second explanation, and it fails harder. The 1918 pandemic was 5 years gone, and more importantly, influenza does not kill 23 people simultaneously in a single night with no preceding illness. Nobody had been sick. The delivery driver had been up that ridge 4 days earlier and spoken with 2 of the sisters at the door. Mass suicide is the third, and it requires a substance, and a substance requires a container. There was no container, no glass, no residue, no notes, and no disturbance in a building where 23 women would have had to coordinate their own deaths without knocking over a single chair. So we are left with the thing nobody wants to say out loud, which is that we do not know. And into that gap walks the part of this story that has nothing to do with nuns at all. Because the convent was not the only building on that ridge that stopped making sense once people started looking. When the state finally sent a survey crew to Carrow's Bend in 1931, 8 years after the deaths, they found a town that had been slowly buried. Not abandoned, buried. Mud from the slopes had risen against the buildings on the lower street to a depth of nearly 6 feet, and the crew's report notes something that reads like a throwaway line, and absolutely is not. They noted that several structures on the main street had windows and doorways below the mud line. Full doorways. Below ground. The obvious reading is that decades of runoff filled the valley floor and swallowed the first floors of buildings that were originally at grade. That is what a geologist would tell you, and it is probably correct. The other reading, the one that has built an entire online movement, is that the buildings were already partially buried when the coal companies arrived, and that the people who showed up in the 1880s did not build that town. They moved into it. They found stone structures with their ground floors packed with silt. They cleared what they could. They put wood frame houses in the gaps, and they told the story that made sense to them, which was that they had built it themselves. This is the core of what people now call the Tartaria theory, and I am going to be honest with you about it. Because you deserve better than a channel that just feeds you what you came for. Much of that theory is not supported by evidence. The mainstream explanations for grand old architecture are mostly correct. Labour was cheap, ornamentation was standard, stone was local, and the buildings look impossible to us because we have forgotten how much 100 skilled masons could do in a year when they were paid almost nothing to do it. But the theory did not come from nowhere. It came from a real and specific gap, and the gap is this. We have an enormous amount of documentation about who owned things in the 19th century, and a strange shortage of documentation about who made them. The ledgers survive, the blueprints often do not, and in company towns specifically, where the company owned the store, the currency, the housing, the doctor, the church, and the records, the paper trail was designed to be self-reporting, and nobody has ever really audited it. The Sisters of the Perpetual Ledger were keeping a book. We know they were keeping a book because Verna Doyle described one, a bound volume the sisters carried between the chapel and the office, and because Renfrew mentioned it to the sheriff when he described what he had seen. It was on the desk. It was open. It was not there when the county came back to seal the building 4 days later. Everything else in that convent stayed exactly where it was for 80 years, the furniture, the plates, the habits hanging on their hooks. Somebody drove up a washed-out mountain road days after a mass death to retrieve a single book of accounts and left everything else untouched. Whatever was in that ledger, someone valued it more than they valued 23 lives. And there is one more absence in this story, the one that should bother you most. When Renfrew walked through that building, he did not find a single child. The dormitory on the 3rd floor held 31 beds. 29 of them had been slept in. The sheets were turned back the way you leave a bed when you climb out of it and expect to come back to it. Shoes were lined up underneath the frames. There was a rag doll sitting on the windowsill. And there was nobody in that room at all. The sheriff's inquest ran 6 days and produced 11 pages. It mentions the children exactly once, in a single sentence stating that their whereabouts could not be established, and then it moves on to the disposal of the bodies. Nobody in Carrows Bend ever filed a missing person report. Nobody wrote to Baltimore or Philadelphia to ask. And that makes a terrible kind of sense once you understand how the orphan trains worked, because on paper, those children had already been delivered. They had been signed for. They were, administratively speaking, somewhere else. And that is the part I keep coming back to. Not the impossible architecture, not the mud, not the dry bodies in a soaked building. The part that keeps me up is the accounting. 400 children moved into a building that has no construction record, in a town that has no census, after 1931, funded by a company whose expense ledger shows no expenses, run by an order the church never chartered, keeping a book that disappeared inside 4 days. Something in that valley was being counted, and someone did not want the count to survive. The convent is still up there. It is on private land now, and the current owner has never given an interview and has never allowed a survey. The state has no record of who bought it. The deed transfer in 1948 lists the purchaser as a holding company that dissolved the following year. The stone is still perfect. 101 years of Appalachian winters, and there is not a crack in the facade. If you want to understand how a whole town can disappear from the record while the buildings stay standing, watch the video on screen now. It covers the 17 company towns in that same corridor that were struck from the census between 1928 and 1935, and what the survey crews found when they finally went back in. Subscribe, and I will keep pulling this thread.